So I don't know if I could name you a book that I've read in college that wasn't assigned in class. It's not that I don't like reading, I love reading. I read all the time when I have a chance. I read newspapers, magazines, journals, just mostly not books. I think this mainly has to do with how I grew up. See, my mom, she was an English teacher, so I was smothered and drowned in books. Whenever I finished one, I was tossed in the backseat of the car and dragged over to Barnes& and Noble or forcibly signed up for the summer reading challenge at my local library against my will. For example, something that would happen was if a friend was coming over on the weekend, I'd have to sit down and trudge through a book for an hour or so beforehand, because heaven forbid I went one day without reading a book. Between this and school, books began to mostly feel like a chore that got in the way of stuff like fun and enjoyment. Things began to shift for me when I was around 10. What happened was my dad started working from home, and he didn't really care what I did. And every day when we were sitting at the kitchen table, he'd read the newspaper. So while I was sitting there eating my Lucky Charms and my Wildberry Pop-Tarts, eventually I hesitantly began reading the sports section of the Baltimore Sun. At first, it wasn't really so much reading because I was just memorizing the box scores. I was really into numbers, and for the longest time, I couldn't understand why the sports page wasn't just an enlarged version of the back of the baseball cards that I collected. There I sat every morning committing to memory the batting averages, the slugging percentages, on-base percentages, and the like of every player that was on my lousy and beloved Orioles. This information was generally useless to most people unless you were, say, Jim Palmer or Mike Bordick doing the play-by-play every evening. But I did find a use for it. I was able to do that. See, if there's one thing that I've always enjoyed, it's winning. And all my pals and I, we would always argue about sports. Questions like, who should the Orioles sign in free agency? Was Andy MacPhail a good hire? Would the Orioles finish last or second to last this season? For a period of time, these questions dominated my life in my immediate friend group. And all this reading helped me win more arguments, fueling my devotion to the sports section. And I did eventually realize that there was more to this newspaper than just the box score bird on page 12, and I slowly began to branch out. There was only one problem. I had this useful reading now that I wanted to do, but how was I going to make time for that with my mom's constant insistence on novels? I had to get clever to get around this. So for Christmas, I'd ask for things like subscriptions to Sports Illustrated magazines, FCA magazines, National Geographic, The Washington Post. Now, normally, when I ask for Christmas presents like a PlayStation or a new bike or a new phone, I usually got socks. So I was pleasantly surprised when the scheme I had hatched actually worked. Now I was armed with enough newspapers and magazines to read in order to ward off my mother's constant onslaught of books. I really pulled a fast one by her. It wasn't until I read Elie Wiesel's Night in 10th grade when I began to consider that books might not be all bad. In recent years, I've got to admit, books have grown on me, and I guess it was a good thing that my mom had me read so much as a kid, because now I really love reading, and I read all the time. It just worked out this way that just about all my leisure reading is nonfiction, and that's how I became the reader I am today.